Alright guys, welcome back to Formula 1 news. Ferrari have a new rear suspension to unveil at the Belgian Grand Prix, but it's not all good news for the Scuderia. Reports emerging that next year's cars will likely move again away from the pull rod front suspension that the teams have gone towards over the last few seasons. Ferrari, after 3 years of push rod, switched to pull rod for this season in 2025, and next year that may not be relevant at all. Have Ferrari seriously mismanaged their resources over these last few months? What does it mean for 2026 and beyond? Very much enjoy your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always, I greatly appreciate it. As ever, there's plenty going on in the Formula 1 world. We're just going to start here with some driver stuff. We don't know what's going to happen at Red Bull. I know that Formula Racers were talking about where Yuki Tsunoda's going to end up. Is it going to be Red Bull? Is it going to be V-Carb? I don't see him going back to the junior team. The only way that would happen is if Honda was still there supporting, and they're not. Is Cadillac an option? Is somewhere else going to happen? As I said yesterday, I think, the more people think about this question, the more it might become relatively clear that, well, Cadillac could be an option. Maybe Aston Martin isn't out of the total realms of possibility, but it doesn't seem like on current evidence Yuki's going to be staying at Red Bull. He needs a very impressive second half of the season, and I'm not sure that RB21 frankly has it in it, unless there's Max Verstappen behind the wheel. And if Cadillac is an option, the, let's say, competition for that spot is very heavy indeed. We know that Valtteri Bottas has been a consideration over there. We expect that to continue. We think that Sergio Perez has a very good chance of getting that drive as well. And even Mick Schumacher. It's interesting what it means for Mick, whether I still think it's pretty doubtful that he gets back into F1. Maybe he would deserve another chance. If he gets it, I think, I'd be like, you know what, fair enough. Let's see how it goes. Because the time at Haas was not great. People obviously talk about Gunter Steinen's involvement in that time not being so supportive of Mick. Is he Michael? No, but you know what we're saying, right? Toto Wolff has obviously supported him. He's gone to Alpine and done some good things in the World Endurance Championship. Of course, he would like to return to Formula 1. Cadillac is maybe an option. He says there's a very positive update there, but, I feel like he will be outcompeted by some other candidates. We know there's still even talk about the likes of a Felipe Drugovich, but I'm not sure really how likely that feels right now. It's Perez, it's Bottas, it's maybe Tsunoda, and then there's some consideration for Zhou Guanyu even, right, to potentially reform. Kind of what Sauber were up to a couple of years ago with Zhou and Bottas is not impossible because of Cadillac's interest in the Chinese market. Vettel, I know it wasn't that long ago, people were saying could even come back to F1. The recent talk was would he go to Red Bull and kind of replace Marco? I don't think he would ever be replacing Horner, certainly not yet. But there was a feeling that maybe Vettel back to Red Bull in some sort of advisory role. That hasn't really happened yet, and there's talk about Vettel maybe getting more broadly involved in the world of endurance racing. Could he do it with Aston Martin, where he finished his career in F1? Possibly. There's an option open there, maybe. I know there's also been a lot of talk about when, maybe not even if, but when Stroll is going to do world endurance, because I think Stroll's skill set is really, and I'm not going to try and force this, but Stroll has been in Formula 1 for a long time. I think he is a better driver than people give him credit for, but he's not a great driver, right? People seem to think that he's terrible or he's a Latifi. He's not. He's talented enough, Stroll, but he's just pretty underwhelming, and he wouldn't be around if it wasn't for his father and the situation in the sport. To this point, I wouldn't imagine. But he's okay. It just feels like Lance isn't particularly motivated, and there's lots of people that would suggest that the WEC would make so much sense for Lance, because we know that he's pretty proficient in the wet. I mean, he does his best races in those mixed, difficult conditions, and the World Endurance Championship would be great for that. It seems like his strengths as a driver tend to lean towards not being especially dramatically fast, but being relatively metronomic and consistent. I feel like he would kill it in WEC. And I think he will do it at some point. Obviously, for now, he's still got the F1 dream, or maybe his father still has the F1 dream for him, I don't know. But just speaking of Aston Martin, I thought that was relevant to say, because surely that will be a talking point over the next couple of years when Aston and Newey surely will say, look, is Stroll the man who's going to help us win a constructors title? He's obviously, realistically never going to be their driver's champion potential. They're going to try and get Max or see what Alonso can do in 26, maybe get Russell, right? There's options like this out there for Aston Martin. And, at some point there will be pressure on. I know that there was talk when Newey joins as to say, well, how keen is Newey really going to be to join a team that still has Lance Stroll around? Because it seems indicative of some lack of ambition, but I think maybe that will change in the coming years. Now, there was a bit of drama around Ferrari, and there's plenty to talk about with Ferrari as always, but this is pretty interesting. So Gunther Steiner was asked about Hamilton and the state of the sport, and he made a couple of interesting comments. Now, we'll get to this tweet here, of course, in a second, but this is what Gunther Steiner had to say. Steiner, appearing on the Business of Sport podcast, said he sees a conflict at times between Hamilton and Ferrari due to the brand that Hamilton has become in his own right, giving him unique power. So Steiner went on to say this: I think in F1, the only one, as in the only driver above a team, is Lewis Hamilton. His presence, his stature, it is very big outside of the sport as well. You're big in the sports, then when you get big outside of the sport, you're bigger than the actual team. It's the same in football. It happens, with a Messi or Ronaldo or whatever. I think in F1, the only one that can claim that is Lewis at the moment. I think Max is very big in the sport, but he doesn't work on being somebody outside of the sport because for him, his life is racing cars, while Lewis has got another thing, plenty of things, to be honest, as well, that he wants to achieve in life. And I think we see it now with Lewis at Ferrari. They're two huge brands together, and sometimes it's a conflict. Who is bigger, Ferrari or Lewis? And, obviously, I guess that has some implication for the decisions that Ferrari may decide to make, whether they listen to Hamilton, whether they listen to Leclerc. Steiner says, Hamilton wouldn't have been signed if he were calling the shots because Ferrari doesn't need that because it just creates conflict in his eyes. So anyway, that was Steiner's perspective, and it's a debate, isn't it, really? Like, can a driver be bigger than a team? I think definitely a driver can be bigger than a team. Can a driver be bigger than Ferrari as a brand? That is a bit of a different question. If you want to talk about Instagram followers, then yeah, Hamilton I think has more than double what Ferrari have, but that doesn't really extend the cultural relevance, let's say, of Ferrari, but also, whereas Hamilton in the, cultural zeitgeist, whatever you want to say, it's a debate that I don't really know the answer to. Maybe there isn't a clear answer, and frankly, I don't really care. What I care about a little bit is the drama that was happening as a result, right? Because you got some more hardcore Ferrari fans saying, look, no one's bigger than Ferrari, this is the team, that is how it is. And in sports, that's generally a nice thing to believe, but it's not always how it necessarily is in reality. And then, of course, you got some Hamilton fans replying to this, because look, Gazzetta Ferrari, I like this account, I think they do great work, and we'll see more of their stuff in a second, but I find it kind of funny how this account was like, I don't know what you guys are talking about. Like, I wasn't talking about Hamilton, I was just making a statement. It's like, look, clearly this was said because Steiner was making these comments, right? Like, at least I'd be very surprised if it's purely a coincidence, because Steiner's comments came out, I think, pretty much at the same time that this tweet went out. But anyway, so then Gazzetta Ferrari said, we've seen that some fan accounts are trying to discredit us through this post to just gain attention for themselves. Those who have been following us in the very beginning always know we've treated both of our drivers with equal respect and affection. Perhaps the reason behind this smear campaign is that we've nearly doubled the mentioned accounts in just 6 months, even starting behind them. Perhaps the reason behind this smear campaign is that we've nearly doubled the mentioned accounts in the last 6 months, even starting behind them, as a Ferrari fan page will continue to support our drivers with love. So, I don't know, I thought it was all rather funny, and you had the likes of FIA Girly in the replies talking about this, and I don't know why these accounts need to be beefing on social media, who really cares? But it all started because is Hamilton or Ferrari bigger than one another? All that Ferrari have done in the last couple of decades is disappoint the fans. That's what I will say. And this is a pretty crazy stat. Since 2009, there have only been 4 drivers to ever have even led the championship at some point with Ferrari. Vettel was in the championship lead for 18 races across his time with Ferrari, Alonso for 14 races, Leclerc has enjoyed some time at the head of the championship with 5 races, and Massa was actually leading for 1 race, I think back in 2010. Some would argue that 2008 he should have been, or whatever, right? I think that lawsuit is still ongoing. The point is that Ferrari can talk a big game, but the reality is they haven't really delivered. I mean, you're talking, it's only been not even that many races where they've even been leading the Drivers' Championship in the last couple of decades. It's not a pretty sight. And what's also not a pretty sight is the fact that Charles Leclerc, one of the best qualifiers on the grid, if not one of the best in the history of Formula One, has struggled heavily in qualifying this year. Look at some of these numbers. 7 poles in 2019, 2 in 2021, 9 in 2022, 5 in 2023, 3 in 2024. And so far this year, halfway through the season, 0 in 2025. There's also another remarkably frustrating stat for Leclerc. that whenever he's won a race in a season, the next season he's not won a race. And that's happened consistently now for the last couple of years. Won in 2019, didn't in 2020, and then in 2022 started out by winning, and then 23 didn't win. Obviously that season was dominated, and then Sainz got the Grand Prix win back in Singapore. Then 24 won a couple of Grand Prix, and this year has been a donut so far, and it's the same for pole position. So it's a tough one for Ferrari, but of course they're looking to turn their season around pretty much from now onwards. I mean, many of the other teams have already long given up on this year's championship, and any upgrades they bring have been in the works long ago. But we know that Ferrari have at least committed a sizable amount of resources still to try and figure out this year's car, because the belief is that it's going to help them to some degree with next year. The understanding of the regulations, making sure that the mechanical platform is solid, so that for next year's still semi-ground effect era regulations, it's, let's say, more positive for Ferrari than it has been during this era, certainly since the start of 2022, when things seemed very promising indeed. So they made some changes to the rear suspension. We are going to see it in Belgium. There is a feeling that it's worked. I mean, they've done quite a few things. The pull rod remained, of course, but all these changes required a new gearbox fairing. The front top wishbones have been moved forward, etc., etc. So the layout has changed. They've had to change some things about the gearbox to make it happen at the rear of the car. The front of the car has stayed the same. But these are relatively substantial changes, and there is a feeling that we will see an impact, certainly over the next 2 Grand Prix before the summer break, to see if Ferrari have cooked or whether they have still no idea what they're playing at. The big debate, though, comes around next year. Because there's no doubt, Ferrari, I mean, there literally was reports about this, took developers and engineers off next year's car to work on this new rear suspension for the 2025 car. They could have decided not to do that, but clearly they felt that it was relevant for them to do because they would gain understanding and it would be helpful for next year's concept. Next year's concept is a radical departure from what we have had over the last few years. Lance Stroll even said he doesn't like next year's regulations, but says that drivers won't criticise them for political reasons, and says it's pretty sad that they won't. I think implying things to do with the engine side, really, because a lot of the manufacturers are very on board with this electrification side, although some are kind of moving away from that. I think Honda have said, if you get rid of an electrical component, we're done, right? We're out of here. That's why the FIA and Formula 1 have pushed forward with it, but is it really the best thing to go 50-50? It's causing so many complications. The requirement of active aero as well is back, because if you don't have active aero, then you have not enough power to get yourself down the Monza straight without having to drop down in terms of gears, because the electrical engine just runs out of juice. So you have to drop the downforce down on the straights to even allow you to do it. So it's causing loads of chaos. And lots of drivers have been quite critical of it. Stroll reckons that some won't for what he describes as political reasons. But the other piece about 2026 is what general designs they're going to follow. There is a feeling that they're moving away quite substantially from the ground effect era. We don't really know how much reduction in downforce there's going to be. There is some talk about something in the ballpark of 20%, 20-30% reduction in downforce. So, significant, maybe not totally insane, but, 20%, 25% reduction in downforce seems feasible going into next season, which of course is going to slow down the cars a lot, but maybe it's going to be better, the racing could be better, the cars can follow more easily. But that was meant to be the plan with the 2022 regs. The Venturi tunnels generating the downforce through the floor means that the wings don't need to be as powerful, not causing as much dirty air for the cars behind. But we know that as time has gone on, that's as maybe expected. The teams find ways to put more downforce on, spirit of the regulations, whatever you want to say. And it's caused issues, and maybe they want to go away from that to some degree, because these ground effect cars, they require such a solid mechanical platform, they have to be run at such a stiff suspension level, they just have a natural tendency with the way that the cars and the regulations are designed to understeer at low speed, oversteer at high speed, and they're just tricky cars. None of the drivers really like these cars. Even Max has said that the cars aren't fun to drive, even when he's been winning everything. So I think there's a feeling of trying to move away from that. But De Kester was talking about the underfloor is basically gone. They're pretty much going back to flat floors next year. And that has implications for what the teams are going to decide to do. So this is just a brief snippet of the article they put out on this. I'll leave the entire thing linked down below if you guys want to check it out in full. But just a quick snippet, because he mentions how next year's suspension designs are potentially going to move away from what the teams have been working on. So we know that 7 of the 10 teams have gone towards a pull rod front suspension. That's the way that most of the teams have gone over the last few years, basically copying Red Bull and what Newey designed year 1, right? So Newey put this suspension together year 1. and the pull rod front and the push rod rear is now adopted by basically everyone. Ferrari haven't fully gone to that, but they had literally the opposite, and then they went to the pull rod front and I think the pull rod rear for this season as well. But they made a big change, right? Ferrari, I think, were the only team to change their front suspension concept for this final year of the regulations. Has it worked? I mean, no. But there is a feeling that for next year, the Red Bull-style undercut that we really saw develop halfway through 2022 is going to go away and is going to return to a more conventional design, a more substantial bodywork. The pull rod front and push rod rear is going to probably go away as well. It's no longer seen as dogma. The front axle will be higher, the nose remaining separate from the front wing. So the point pretty much being that there is no longer going to be a requirement for the pull rod front to be, let's say, aerodynamically superior. That was the feeling, that the pull rod and the push rod front suspension can both work in their different ways, but the theory of the engineers was that actually the pull rod front suspension was superior aerodynamically on this generation of cars. That may not be the case next year, and therefore Ferrari may well prefer to go back to what they like and what they tend to know best. Whether Loic Serra has a different opinion, that remains to be seen, as the new kind of head technical guy over there coming in from Mercedes. But they're probably, based on this reporting, going to go back to a pushrod front, which raises questions as to, like, well, why even bother in the first place? Because Ferrari were quite adamant during 2024 that, well, yeah, maybe Red Bull's suspension design is a little better, but we're pretty sure that it's fine. You know, we're happy with what we have. And then they did decide to make the pretty radical change and going to a pull rod front suspension. They didn't have to do that. Nobody else made that change for the final year of the regs. And now they've messed around with their rear suspension as well with this mid-season upgrade. And now we're hearing that a lot of that might just be irrelevant for 2026 because the mechanical platform is less relevant than it was before. If we're going back to basically flat floors, the car can be raised at higher ride heights. You don't need to run it so close to the ground. Your suspension can be a bit softer. Maybe you can even put a bit of rake back in the car that we know that Red Bull like to do an awful lot of towards the end of the, let's say leading up to 2021. So it just raises questions on the way that Ferrari have again managed their resources. It may work out, but it just feels a little bit strange that they've clearly put an awful lot into figuring things out for 2025 and even mid-season too. And now there's feelings that maybe for 2026, a lot of what they've done is actually not going to be so relevant. But at the end of the day, they are third in the championship right now, so they do have more testing time than they previously did. They were second last year, now they're third behind Mercedes. At least they were at the time where the, let's say, cutoff is at the end of June. So that was a critical date because that's when they were behind at the end of June after Canada. It sets them third in the championship, and therefore they have a little bit more testing time than Mercedes do over the coming months. So maybe this is going to make up for it, right? Yeah, maybe they put a bit too much time into this year's car. Maybe they shouldn't have done, but they're still going to have quite a bit more time than McLaren. Maybe they can catch that up. That's kind of the point of the regulations, I guess. But again, Ferrari management comes a little into question. And just to close out the video with, best driver to never win an F1 championship. Interesting question. And there's obviously people are going to give their answers on this. Now, there's a poll here. I think there's a number of names you could probably throw out there. Some people would say Juan Pablo Montoya. Some people might even say someone like Robert Kubica. You could maybe even argue a driver that's, not driven in Formula 1, a Scott Dixon, or even maybe you could argue an Alex Palou recently. But of F1 drivers that have been in F1 and haven't won, the names that come to mind, Gilles Villeneuve has been definitely one who I thought would maybe get more votes in this poll. So Stirling Moss, I'm not going to pretend I watched Stirling Moss race, but I know some of the history, some of the numbers. Moss won a very substantial number of Grand Prix, 15, 16 Grand Prix in not that many starts. He was runner-up in the championship numerous times and never won. So I think there's lots of people that say that based on the numbers and the metrics and the history and people that did watch him race and stuff, that Stirling Moss probably is the answer here. Felipe Massa, you could maybe argue as well, but lots of the votes maybe understandably going to Charles Leclerc. Obviously, there's going to be a bit of recency bias in these discussions, but maybe he's worthy of throwing into the conversation. So very much interested to your thoughts in the comment section below. And actually, I will just give one final thing. For your own sanity, says F1 Big Data, don't check the forecast for this week at Spa. So, of course, I did, and I found the following. Now, it is raining a lot of the week in Spa. Now, I will say, the weather data here does not imply it's especially dramatic, thunderstormy, insane rain. it's going to be light rain basically all week in Spa, and we're expecting that to continue into the weekend as well. So expect a weather-affected weekend, but hopefully nothing like what we had 4 years ago. So very much interested in your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new, take care, and I'll see you next time.